All right, so hello everybody, and good morning or good late evening, depending on where you're watching this from. My name is Joe, and I'm your host tonight for the first late night Destiny horror movie hangout. Joining me today is Carrie from the United States. Hello, Carrie.
Hi.
And also from the other side of the world, we have Kim joining us from South Africa. Hello, Kim.
Hi, yes.
All right, so tonight we're going to be talking about the film Horns, and I felt that this was a really interesting pick for a Destiny Hangout, as you'll see in a moment, because it covers so many different dimensions that we can easily relate to in terms of walking our process and the understanding of backchat and emotions and possession. So this will be, I'm sure, a fairly lively discussion. There's so much to get into. For those of you that haven't gotten a chance to watch the film, the premise, if you'll imagine with me, is the main character is given a set of supernatural abilities, and one day he wakes up with horns growing out of his head. And the curious thing is, the people around him start to act out their innermost suppressed thoughts and feelings, whether it's vengeance or feelings of self-doubt or hatred. And all of the things that people normally bury inside themselves start playing out all around him. And he also gains the ability to influence people, basically play on people's innermost desires and have them act them out as though they lose control and become possessed by their own thoughts, their own desires, their own innermost darkest secrets. So that was really fascinating to watch, but before we get into that, I wanted to first touch with our guests. So, were there any particular scenes that you guys remember most, or any particular moments that really struck out when you watched it? And let's go to Carrie first for that.
The one that stands out to me the most is when he's sitting in the waiting room of the doctor's office, and he's sitting next to this lady, and her kid is just screaming and carrying on at the top of her lungs. And she looks over at him, and she's just like, you know what? Sometimes I just want to kick her in the fucking ass. And he's like, what? And this is when it first starts happening, when people start telling him, what's going on in their secret minds. And then the receptionist gets in on it, and she's like, she needs to take her kid out of here. And then this whole scene starts happening, of people just playing off of each other. And it continues from there. Just everybody that he comes in contact with just starts telling him what's going on, and they can't focus on anything else but what they're obsessing about in their mind.
Yeah, definitely. That basically is our first introduction to what would unfold throughout the entire film, is this idea of people around him kind of losing the ability to suppress themselves. So basically whatever's in their heads, whatever they may have been thinking these things for a long, long time, but never actually expressed it until now. So we see all these strange playouts happen spontaneously, but when we have a look at it, one thing that I noticed about that I found was interesting was you notice that these people ask him for permission before acting out. So, like the example, except for the little girl, which I thought was interesting, because she kind of, which was just her own nature, just, this is who I am. But the adults would actually expose their inner thoughts and ask him, like the lady, oh, I just want to kick my little daughter. Should I do that? And they wait and see his response. So I thought that was really interesting. But we'll touch into that much further, not much further, but later on in this discussion, because that's a big core of the theme in this movie. But for now, I want to toss it over to Kim. Kim, did you have any particular themes or scenes that you felt really struck out or stuck out in the film that you want to open up?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind in terms of what I found most familiar in relation to myself, if, for instance, I would place myself in the same position as those people, and I would imagine myself being the one who opens up about my internal hidden secret desires or whatever, then it would be that girl who stuffs her face with donuts. Like, she's actually, I think, the only one who doesn't lash out against other people. She's actually like having a sort of self-abusive nature or tendency. So she's like, I'm worthless anyway, so do you mind if I just go ahead and abuse myself here? And yeah, that was basically a scene that I could relate to in terms of the process that I've walked.
Yeah, that's a really good one too, because that's a good point. And most of the other characters, you see, they resort to kind of a vengeance mentality or kind of an abusive mentality where they strike out against others or they try to manipulate others to their own advantage. But that particular person doesn't do that. But what she does is she kind of, like you said, internalizes it, and she is kind of her own worst enemy. And when she's around the main character, I think that's the element that gets fuel. It's her own self-destructive, self-diminishing nature. You'll notice later in the film she goes into explaining more about how she always was in love with the main character and felt like it was never reciprocated, and that she had to lower herself and make herself cheap in order to gain acceptance from others. So you see this pattern of this character throughout her life, not having a sense of self-worth, not having a sense of self-acceptance, and how that carries over into that pattern of, oh, let me just stuff myself and get fat. Who cares? I have no value anyway. I may as well just do what feels good, which to me might be, consuming sweets and, indulging. At least I'll have that because I'm not getting anything else. So that was really interesting to see how that played out. Do you guys want to chime in with anything so far that we've brought up? Any other elements or dimensions that you see that you can discuss, or did any of this relate to you in a personal way, where it's something that you've walked through as part of your personal process?
I could say most of it I could relate to. All of the backchat, it goes on inside me. So it wasn't like I was shocked to hear anything that was going on. But what I found interesting, Joe, is like the point that you brought up about how they were asking permission, or if he gave them permission, they're like, okay, I'll do it then. So I wonder, are we asking, permission, secretly inside ourselves, to act these things out, but something, but we're telling ourselves it's something that we can't do. That's what's holding us back. And like if somebody says, well, you can do that, that's perfectly fine, then we'll just go ahead and do it. I found that fascinating because I can see that in myself. Right?
Is there a particular instance that you can relate? It doesn't have to be uber personal, but is there a specific context where you see that happening in your life that maybe people can relate to?
When I was quitting smoking, I had gone, for weeks just being miserable and crying and just being an absolute mess and having little temper tantrums and whatnot. And I had a talk with a friend who I really, respected their perspective, and I looked up to them, and they said, Carrie, go out and buy a pack of cigarettes and never, ever do it again. I'm like, okay. I did. I went and I got the pack of cigarettes. It's like, okay, thank you for the permission.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating point. This thing of permission that I saw throughout the film, and I thought it was interesting because it's almost as though because they're asking for permission, and you have this figure, this devil figure, that seems to have this authority. It's like, oh well, the devil said it was okay, so it must be okay. And if anything wrong happens or if anything bad happens, it's not on me. Why? Because the devil made me do it. right?
Yeah.
So we
Right.
have this idea of like, also when you look at some of the things that the characters play out, it's really nasty stuff. Even with the girl who was self-abusive and kind of eating herself into some kind of self-acceptance that obviously we know doesn't work. But we notice the behaviors that they act out are generally destructive and abusive and not good for anybody. Uh, and normally people wouldn't do those things unless two things happen, I think. First of which, they go through some kind of traumatic experience, and their emotions or their suppressed thoughts and irritations and all of that stuff kind of takes over as a response to that trauma. Or we see the other thing happen, which is what they showed in the film, which is an authority comes in and they allow themselves to ask for permission from that authority, even though that authority has no actual authority. It's perceived. So it's like, because we have this devil figure and they didn't go through a trauma experience that would allow them to face consequences through their playouts, they had this enabling devil figure that gave them the crash course, so to speak. So instead of going through a traumatic life experience where you question what you did or you have that moment of reflection, you instead have this permission to just act it all out. And there's no consequence, just do it. But obviously the consequence is much worse in that case. What do you guys think about that?
That's a really interesting point. It's like, I mean, the very excuses we've been using throughout the ages is like the devil made me do it.
Yeah.
Or, in our case, maybe right now, for people who don't necessarily believe in God or call themselves atheists, it's like, yeah, the voice in my head made me do it, or my childhood traumatic experiences made me do it, or some kind of evil person who abused me or who did something bad to me made me do it. So it's always like the bad person or the devil who makes us do things that we apparently don't want to do. But it's fascinating that those things that we say we don't want to do is actually the things that we enjoy the most. Like, I mean, I find with myself that I actually enjoy going into anger and breaking stuff and destructive, because it's like the secret, indulgent kind of addictive energy.
Yeah, it's an
But
energetic rush.
Yeah.
Definitely. Carrie, did you have anything to add to that point, or what we've talked about just now?
Nope, nothing to add.
Okay. Just to wrap up the point, yeah, I just thought it was really fascinating the way they portrayed that. And to add to that element of asking for permission, we see that in the example that you gave, Kim, about how, oh, we can always say the devil made me do it, or the voices in my head made me do it, or the anger inside me made me do it, or the loneliness I felt made me do it, or any of that. But it also extends outward into the world outside of us, where we see people that would say, well, the government made me do it. I was just following orders. My boss made me do it. My society made me do it. So we have this element of shifting authority, actually. I was going to say blame, but it's actually shifting authority, where we push the authority outside of ourselves as though that relieves us from responsibility and consequence, when we see time and time again that's not the case. And particularly that's something that we address within Walking Process. The tools that are involved, it's always about bringing it back to yourself. And what is that? That's a form of reclaiming authority, self-authority, where you stop blaming and shifting, and when you do that, you'll find that you're going to be less swayed by those arguments of, oh, my emotions made me do it. No, because I understand what my emotions are. The society made me do it. No, because I understand I'm part of society and I have a personal responsibility. So just to throw in how this movie could have been completely different if the characters were walking process. If they had these tools, would they necessarily have all of this backchat that would activate? And how different would it have been? And would things have gotten so out of hand and so crazy when the main character got his horns? Maybe people would just be normal because they didn't have all that internal stuff. So that was the point I wanted to wrap up there. Were there any other particular scenes or anything that stuck out for you, Kim, with this film?
Let's see. Not necessarily. I mean, I thought the whole movie was just pretty interesting in terms of the general theme, and especially in relation to destiny and what we do, and it is a very fascinating kind of piece of art that we can use to show, where we are at as humanity inside of ourselves, and what happens when we don't investigate ourselves, when we keep things suppressed and hidden inside of ourselves. So, yeah, don't necessarily have specific points to bring up about it.
Okay, very cool. Carrie, were there any other really specific moments in the film that stuck out for you, or anything that struck a particular chord?
Another interesting part I found was with the necklace, with the cross, and how whoever wore the cross, he immediately interpreted them as being good because they didn't see the horns, and they didn't see him as, being, all devilish and whatever, and they weren't trying to tell him what was going on in their minds and trying to get permission to do it. And then he removed the necklace from this one guy who he thought was great and pure and good, and the necklace, the cross was actually suppressing it. And he removed the cross, and all this bad came out. And then later on in the movie, he wore the cross, and he was trying to be all good. The horns went away, everything bad just disappeared, and there was even at one point where he had wings, if I remember correctly, angel wings that eventually turned, back into him burning and, being all, the devil as you actually see the devil in hell. So I saw that as an interesting part. But to me, it was like the cross was actually suppressing what was going on inside. Wasn't really making them good.
I thought that was very interesting as well, with the cross. And like the darkness hiding behind the light kind of thing.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, that's a great one. And there's so much to be said about that. Because when I look at that, it's as though, so take, for example, the guy that had the necklace, and throughout the film, in the beginning, he's the only one that doesn't see the horns. And to the main character, this person, this friend of his, represents everything that's right, everything that's sane. So this guy looks like he's the only guy that you can trust because there's nothing bad going on. He's not coming up to him, airing out all his internal negative stuff. So maybe he just doesn't have any. And he's the only one that doesn't see me as the devil with my horns. He's the only one that doesn't see me that way. So I think for the main character, there was a little bit of attachment, a little bit of wanting to hold on to that humanity of himself with this one friend that seems like the best person out of the entire cast of people in his life. But what do we learn? We learned that that cross that he was wearing was helping him keep his secrets hidden. And the one person that was able to hide everything turned out to be the worst. So I thought that was really interesting because we have this idea of, oh, look at all these people that do all these messed up things. But then we find out that the person that was hiding and suppressing everything the most and getting away with it turned out to have the worst consequence. And at the end, he was the one that got the results of that consequence the worst, I would say. because you see that even at the end, there was no point of redeeming himself. There's no point of actually. What was interesting too was towards the end, you'll see him in a few moments when he gets caught. He'll try to apologize or try to make things right, and then at the first opportunity, he'll turn around and try to stab you again.
Yeah.
And then you wrestle him down and you get him into a position where he has to face himself, and he'll be apologetic, and he'll make he'll kind of go through the motions of seeming to have empathy and remorse for his consequences. But then that moment comes back and he sees an opportunity, he snaps right back into it. So that goes to show, to me, the people that don't have that sense of self-awareness and have that sense of deliberate self-manipulation, deliberate self-deception, deliberate suppressing, will have the worst time of getting to a point of self-honesty, getting to a point of self-acceptance, and they'll, I think, have the worst or most difficult challenge of getting to a point of, I don't want to say repentance, but we can call it setting things right with yourself and with how you are co-creating this world with the people here. Do you guys have any input on that?
Carrie?
I think you pretty much covered it, Joe. It's coming to terms with yourself, and it just kind of all brings everything together, though, because if you look at through the entire thing, we've got the blame, we've got the suppression, we've got the looking to others to say, oh, it's okay, looking up to authorities. It's this really messed up scenario that we've got that we can definitely see playing out in the world, when all that it would take was to say, okay, you know what, this is a part of me, I admit it, and I see that it's not the best thing, and I see the consequences that will happen if I actually act this out and play this out. How do I change this? So it's just, for me, I found that when I take responsibility for all this stuff that's going on in my head, I don't have all the stuff in my head. Like, it doesn't influence me, it doesn't affect me, it doesn't drive me. And that's what we're doing, in the Desteni I process, is we're taking responsibility for all of that stuff so that it no longer moves us and influences us.
Cool.
Yeah,
Yeah, I
right
definitely agree with what Carrie said here.
Cool.
And also, like, in relation to the point that you mentioned with the guy wearing the cross who was actually the one who didn't see the horns and who was seen as like the perfect guy almost, like what I was thinking before I saw what played out in the end was that actually that's someone who embraced his evil side, like he's actually doing it deliberately, whereas most people have their evil side like more suppressed and going on in the background of their mind, but they're like still consciously thinking, I'm a good person, because we just don't tend to see the moments wherein we actually do lie and cheat and do things secretly, because we just don't want to see it. But like this guy actually knows what he's doing. He's doing it deliberately, like like a serial killer almost. Like he knows what he wants and he's gonna go for it, and he's gonna lie and cheat, and he doesn't care about God judging him. So that's why he can also present himself as this good person and make it entirely believable, because he doesn't have guilt playing in the background. He doesn't have all those emotions playing in the background that we would experience when we're faced with God or faced with judgment, and that makes us want to suppress and hide our evil side. So that's actually a fascinating point, I find, is that the ones who are the best at convincing everybody else that they are a good person are actually the ones who have completely embraced their evil side and have become it, and don't fear God or judgment or anything, because they know that there is no such thing as God. There's no such thing as judgment, so they can basically do whatever they want, which is the same with, if you look on a global scale, like the same with people who make money out of abusing or using and exploiting people or beings, are those kind of people who know that there's no judgment, there's no God watching them, so they can just do whatever they want, while presenting this perfect image of themselves.
That's an awesome point. I didn't think of it that way, but that brings in so much. That's awesome.
And
Because
you know what's interesting is they're so good at convincing other people because they convince themselves. They're so good at convincing themselves. They believe it.
bingo.
Or they just, like, they know what they're doing. Like, they're actually the most aware of themselves, but they just don't care. While everybody else is like, I have to be a good person, so we try to convince ourselves that we're a good person because we fear God. So it's actually also interesting how people in power would use religion as the fear of God to make people want to suppress their own urges to, for instance, be greedy and go out there and make money and exploit everybody else, so that the ones in power can be the ones to exploit everyone because they don't fear God.
That's such an interesting point because it reminds me of what we talked about earlier, how all the other characters would ask for permission before acting out their internal suppressed things, except for this guy that had that amulet or the necklace. And I think that was really interesting symbology, because here's a guy that in a way does have a kind of self-authority, in that he doesn't ascribe to morality or right or wrong. He just does what he does,
Yeah.
and he doesn't wait for permission. So I think it was an interesting symbology that we see there, that he's the character that never asked for permission to act out what he did, because he didn't need permission. He was his own permission. But unfortunately, the starting point was self-interest. The starting point was him getting what he wanted at the expense of others without consideration. And while he did have self-authority and that kind of empowered him, the fact that he did separate himself and put his own self-interest above everyone else at all costs, that kind of gamble didn't work out for him too well in the end. And we also see that in terms of our own lives, when we go into the sense of self-righteousness because, maybe we know a bit about ourselves, and that's it. That's all I need to know. Nobody's in charge of me. Okay, great. I'm going to take over everything now, right? So, yeah, I didn't even notice that until you mentioned this. That's just really interesting. I'm kind of playing back the movie now and realizing he was the only one that never asked for permission to act out his internalized desires.
I didn't even register the permission point, so that's also a very cool thing to mention.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing is, if you notice, his starting point started with the relationship
Mm-hmm.
that he had with, or this relationship that he made up in his mind with this girl that was the girlfriend of the main character. So he built up this relationship in his mind, and to where it was real, and like she wanted him, and he couldn't see beyond that. He'd already played it out to the end. They were going to be together. She was into him. She loved him, and she was leaving the main character for him. So when it didn't play out the way he anticipated it playing out is when things got bad. And that's when I would say that he just finally snapped and just said, I'm justified in this.
Yeah, I think, what you're talking about in relation to how you're describing his, like, personality or how he thinks, is that would probably be described by psychologists as like the psychopath personality as someone who doesn't have that little voice in his head that is like our social awareness in relation to how others think about us and how God thinks about me and judgments and stuff like that. Like he doesn't have that. So
Yeah.
I mean, we all have those kind of desires. Like we all fantasize about someone we want to be with, and we hope that they will at some point be with us, and we all fall in love, and we all create scenarios in our minds about, you know, what we want for our lives, but then we don't actually go out there and kill people for it because we have that social awareness and because we have that kind of fear of God or fear of each other.
The
But
fear of
then
the
there are people who
consequence
don't
of
have,
what could happen. Yeah.
yeah, so
Yeah.
the people who don't have that would be the psychopaths of society, so to speak. But they're also the ones who actually get what they want, you know, because they go for it. He's just kind of unlucky because he killed someone and he got caught.
Yeah.
Right, and that's also really interesting to look at too when we look at the starting point of that character that ended up being the villain in the movie, because it did start with a kind of jealousy, right? It started off with a kind of desire for this girl, and noticing that she was with the main character and not him. And oh, this happened when they were quite young. So you've got the span of time going on where in his own mind he's building up his own ideal relationship to this girl to such an extent where it became so real that when events started to happen where he saw an opportunity to live that fantasy out and to be told that he's got the wrong picture, that created such a huge cognitive dissonance for him. Why? Because of all of the time, all of the energy invested into this kind of projected ideal fantasy relationship that to him became more than him. And when that reality couldn't be real in the real sense, I think that was what flipped that trigger. And that was, I think, the last moment that he was himself, and he started to become his um, unmanifested desires, so to speak. At that moment, he was possessed by what? By his own mental creations. And this is exactly what we work with in Destiny, because obviously we don't have people going to such extremes. We would hope not. But within Destiny, why is it important to write out and put out the things that are going on inside your head so that you can look at it on paper? It's because it discharges all of the emotions, it discharges of the anger and the anxiety, and you can actually look at the consequences. You can see exactly where that is going to lead you if you continue and don't question. And that kind of, I think, speaks to what you brought up just now, Kim, that sense of self-regulation that seems to be absent in sociopaths, for example. They might not, they don't have that self-regulating awareness of, if I do this and this and this, the consequence is this, and this consequence is not what I want, so I stop here. And that is played out very well in the film, I think, and it speaks a lot to what we do in Process, which is exactly to shortcut and short circuit those patterns before they become possessions. What do you guys think about that? What are your thoughts?
Carrie?
My thoughts are understanding the patterns. So we can take characters like these and we can actually, as we've just done, we can trace back to how it started. And once you understand how it starts, you can actually support yourself, you can support others. That's the point that I want to make, is that so we can't really go into judgment about these characters, or thinking, oh wow, they're so evil, or they have no conscience, or they have no grasp of reality or whatnot. we have to actually look at the whole thing over time and understand where they're coming from and actually be honest about how it exists within ourselves. That's the point that I would like to make.
Cool.
Yeah, that's awesome. And that goes right back to the starting point of it all, which is to always bring it back to yourself, and to realize that everything is interdependent. It's so easy, especially in movies, to see the villain as only the villain and judge them only by the consequences and not understand how those consequences are created not necessarily by the villain themselves, but also through the nature of relationships and life events that they had to face. Some of that they may not have had control over because they didn't understand themselves or didn't have a self-awareness, and that contributed to chronic problems later on that turns people into villains. So when we look at characters, say, in movies or even people that we meet in our own lives, instead of seeing them for the villain that they represent, it's actually an opportunity to understand how that person created that set of circumstances and what can be done to assist ourselves and, by extension, others to not fall into those patterns, and how to support somebody when they do fall, because we see that they are not the pattern. The villain is not just the villain. There is a life there that we all are. And to help each other reestablish that and, you know, kind of remind each other, hey, you can snap out of this. And I think that's such a gift that we are able to develop for ourselves, especially through the courses offered and the support that we have through Destiny. It's just awesome. Any other feedback on that point?
So, in relation to the point about the villain, and specifically the villain in the movie, and the point that we just discussed of how he created that idea in his mind of he's going to be with this girl and that's just how it's going to be, and he created the idea that she's in love with him, and it's like this whole world playing out in his mind. And also how at Destiny we have solutions to, you know, assist and support ourselves to not go into possessions like that and not end up, you know, killing someone, which is pretty extreme. But I mean, you know, an example in my own life, because I actually recognize that tendency to create those kind of mental projections and mental worlds that don't align with reality at all. Like, I would, for instance, feel attracted to a guy that I see, and I would actually create that whole perception and idea that he also feels attracted to me. And, you know, we're going to end up together eventually, and, you know, all I have to do is just kind of wait until he approaches me, and it's like I already expected certain things to happen, and then I was just a very shy girl and very insecure, so I didn't actually approach him about it, or I didn't act on it. But, like, you know, I never communicated about these things, I was never open about these things, and yet I expected certain things to happen in my world as if they were going to happen and they were true, and then when I realized it wasn't going to happen, I completely fell apart. So if I had just had a different kind of personality, then maybe I would have, like, become violent or something about it. It's entirely possible. So I am also that villain. And through using the Destiny tools, I was able to explore how that specific construct in my mind actually works, you know, and see the consequences and see what I'm actually doing. For instance, you know, the point of just not having talked to this guy at all, like I didn't know him. I didn't know anything about him, and yet he was my prince in shining armor and we were going to have babies together. Like, that's completely insane. And it is actually a form of like a mental illness almost, and I'm very glad that I was able to support myself to see those things about myself and to align who I am inside, you know, in my mind with actual reality, and be able to instead of making assumptions and expectations, rather communicate with people and also communicate about what I want or how I feel or how I see things, and in that be able to understand how reality really works and how other people feel and where other people stand inside of themselves, so that I don't end up making decisions based on assumptions that then create consequences not only in my own life but in the lives of others. That's my take on it.
Awesome,
Awesome.
awesome summary and roundup on everything right there, Kim. I can't I can't add any to that.
Yeah.
Um, we're going to be heading into the closing of our session. Firstly, I'd like to thank both of you for joining me on my maiden voyage into hosting. Thank you so much. This has been an awesome conversation. To those of you watching live or watching the rebroadcast, there will be links to support. Everything that we're talking about here are coming from perspectives that we've gained through applying ourselves through the Destiny process. And I just want to let everybody know that there is support and there is a course available for free for anybody that wants to start gaining that kind of self-awareness and ability to, if you ever wanted to have a Control-Alt-Delete button, but for your life, Desteni I Process is a good way to start setting that up. It gives you the tools to kind of put everything on pause, and instead of going into reactions and feelings and getting possessed by and all the things inside our heads that we don't have the tools or know how to deal with, the Desteni I Process helps you to establish just that. So if you ever wanted that ability to just see everything for the bigger picture and not go into patterns you know are not fulfilling you or not reflecting who you really are or want to be, I strongly suggest checking out the links, and there's a lot of support available. In closing, I want to toss it over to you, Carrie. Did you have any closing statements or anything you'd like to finish off with before we end our discussion tonight?
No, I think everything was covered quite well.
Very cool. And Kim, did you have any closing thoughts for us?
No, I'm pretty satisfied about the conversations that we had, and I enjoyed it very much, so I'm good for now.
All right. Well, so that's going to do it for us. We didn't have any live questions for the transmission and broadcast tonight, so I'm going to go ahead and send off our guests so that Kim can start her morning and Carrie can finish her night. And thank you so much for joining us. You will find more Hangouts on the channel. And oh, actually, we just had a last question pop in. Sorry about that. I just noticed now. So this question is coming from Ida Bra, and she's saying, "Hi guys, what are your perspectives on the girl's father? If you've not talked about that, the girl's father. Can you clarify which girl? I'm assuming you're talking about the
girl who
woman
got
that was killed, the girlfriend. So yeah, that's a great one. Guys, what is your perspective on the father? He was actually another pivotal character in the film that we didn't discuss yet.
The dad was in mourning. He was really in a lot of pain. And everybody in the town saw that the main character did it. And he was so beside himself because he was like, I have loved this kid like my own, and he did this. He couldn't understand. And even when given with the opportunity to kill the main character, he couldn't bring himself to do it. So there was a part of him that I saw knew that he didn't do it. And knew that the daughter loved the main character. Really deeply cared for him. That's what I saw. I just saw a very sad person that had lost somebody they cared for deeply.
Yeah, definitely. Kim, did you have any perspectives on the father?
A moment that stood out in relation to the father character was when he said to the main character when the main character was standing in his doorstep and everybody thought he was dead. And then the father said to him, you know, I've been waiting for you to die for so long, but then when it finally happened, nothing, you know, it didn't make any difference. So that for me showed how we tend to want or expect, when we get angry or we're suffering, we want someone else to suffer because we believe that it's going to provide a solution for us and it's going to somehow end our own suffering. But then, you know, it actually just makes things worse because eventually the whole world ends up suffering. And we just create suffering, so we end up sitting in a pool of suffering with ourselves suffering and everybody else suffering. And that is also, you know, the main problem that we face in our world and inside of ourselves, is that we don't have that, like we don't forgive. We don't forgive ourselves, we don't forgive others, and that's why we only have suffering. So that's my perspective on it.
And that's a great point
That's a really
too.
fascinating point.
And when I look at that, it's kind of this idea that when we do experience that kind of suffering, whether it's anguish or mourning the loss of something, it's very easy to go into that state of mind of something did this to me. Something outside of me is making me feel this way. So my solution is to lash out. Even if I don't see what the target is, everybody looks like a target to me because of what I'm feeling, what I'm experiencing. So everybody's open game. And as long as I do something externally about what I'm feeling, maybe then that'll help me reclaim myself. But what's missed is, again, that point of self-awareness and not understanding that we create our suffering in reaction to the events that unfold in our lives. And we are the solution. And as long as we're passing that buck on to other people, as long as we're looking at the outside as there's something I need to get from them because something was taken from me from the outside, we're always going to be passing along the same, it's kind of like passing along debt to people. You know, I'm in debt because of how I'm feeling now, so how am I going to get better? I'm going to take from somebody else so that I don't have the debt anymore. But what are you doing? You're putting the debt somewhere else. Now imagine if we were all one being. Is that debt really getting anywhere? Is that debt really getting resolved? It's only passing, and it eventually, I tell you what, it's going to tend to pass right back to you because you never dealt with the real issue. So that was a really, really good point. Thank you both for that. That's fascinating. Ida has another follow-up question for us. Let's see. She says he did not act on his emotions towards the main character and did allow himself to see the main character and forgive in some sense. That's an interesting point too. Let's go ahead and throw this to you, Kim. Did you have any feedback on that?
Yeah, so that's pretty cool. That's how I see it as well. The point that I was referring to when I said we don't forgive is more about the statement that he made, like where he said that I wanted you to die for so long, but he did in the end, as he realized that point of you suffering doesn't end my suffering, that's when he was able to, like, just by actually just letting go of his own emotions, because he had a realization, he was able.
Okay, it looks like we. I'm sorry, Kim. It looks like we lost your feed for a minute there. Can you recap on what you were just saying?
Am I clear now?
Yes, you're clear now.
Okay, so where was I?
You were going into. I don't quite remember at this point what point you were, but can you recap the whole point for us?
Okay, so basically, what I was saying is that at the end, when the father had the realization of, your suffering that didn't end my suffering, just by having that realization, his emotions dropped, like his emotions fell away, because he realized that they are actually not valid. Because he realized that even though this main character died, or he thought he died, he's still stuck with his anger and all of his suffering. So with having that realization, he could let go of his emotions, and with letting go of his emotions, he could see the main character, and he could see that the main character isn't this evil person, it's just a person, and he's also suffering. So that is actually a very interesting point that I'm only seeing right now as Ida is raising these questions, is that, that is actually how walking our process works. And, we come to realizations, and because of coming to those realizations, when we write, when we apply self-forgiveness, we are able to release our emotions because we can see that they are not valid. And with releasing our emotions, we can see through the ideas we've created about our world that were based on those emotions. And all of a sudden, we can see our world more clearly as what it actually is. So thank you, Ida, for raising these questions.
Yeah, that's a great question. Carrie, did you have anything to add to Ida's questions for us?
Pretty much just summing up what Kim said, it's reactions never change anything. You can't come to any kind of an agreement with anyone if you're reacting.
Very cool. Ida responds, yes, exactly, Kim. Cool, with a smiley face. Thank you, Ida, for joining in the conversation. So it looks like we're just about coming up to the time where we need to wrap things up. But thank you so much, Ida, for joining in. Those are great questions, and it opened up some really interesting dimensions for sure. For anyone else that has other questions, do feel free to leave them in the comments, and find us on the links that I'm going to provide in the video. You're going to find us on the forums, where you can ask specific questions and get even more feedback, and also familiarize yourself with the tools of Destiny and what we're talking about tonight about the tools and the process. So with that, thank you so much for both of my guests tonight. My name is Joku. I hope you've enjoyed our very first Destiny horror movie night. Tune in again. We will have more. Stay tuned to this channel, and we will be updating you on the next events to come. Thank you so much.
Bye.